2,000 years ago, the land we now call Israel was a Roman province known as Judea. The Jewish people living there were governed by the largest superpower the world had ever seen, but they refused to be subjects of Rome. When the Jews finally rose up in the year 66, Rome responded with overwhelming force. They sent a giant army to take Jerusalem back, and in the year 70, they burned the Great Temple to the ground. For the Jewish people, the temple was the single holiest spot on earth, the one place where they believed they could stand closest to God. After the fire, only a pile of ash remained. A final group of rebels fled into the desert, locking themselves inside a fortress atop the steep cliffs of Masada. When the Romans built a massive dirt ramp to reach them, they found nearly everyone inside already dead. The rebels had chosen to die free rather than surrender, ending the last pocket of Jewish sovereignty in the land. To finish the job, the Roman emperor attempted to wipe the word Judea off the map. He renamed the entire region after the Jews' oldest enemies, a long-gone people called the Philistines. He called it Palestine, banned Jews from Jerusalem, and left behind a physical vacuum that others would eventually fill. About 200 years later, the Roman Empire traded its old gods for Christianity. Suddenly, this dusty province shifted into the spiritual center of the Roman world because it was the setting for the life and death of Jesus. The emperor's mother, Helena, traveled across the empire to track down the locations mentioned in the Bible. She identified one specific hill in Jerusalem as the site where Jesus was buried and commanded her men to start digging until they found it. Her son built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on that spot. It is a monument that has stood for nearly 1,700 years, establishing Jerusalem as a destination for Christian pilgrims from all over the world. As Jerusalem transformed into a Christian city, the Jewish people remained in exile. They were forced to watch from a distance as a new religious identity was built directly over the ruins of their old home. In the year 637, a brand new religion called Islam arrived at the walls of Jerusalem. Unlike the Romans, the Muslim leaders offered a deal. Christians and Jews could keep their faiths and their churches if they paid a tax and lived in peace. But the Muslims also had a deep tie to the city. They believed the Prophet Muhammad rose to heaven from a specific rock, the very same rock where the Jewish temple once stood. In 691, they finished the Dome of the Rock, a golden landmark that still glows over the city today. For the next 1,000 years, control of the land was a violent tug-of-war. European crusaders captured the city in a bloodbath, only for the Muslim leader Saladin to take it back a century later. A kingdom of former slaves called the Mamluks defended the region from the Mongols before the Ottoman Turks eventually swallowed the entire area into their empire. By the 1500s, 3 world religions had anchored their deepest holy sites onto the exact same piece of ground. Each was certain the land belonged to them alone, and there was no peaceful way to share it. While empires fought over Jerusalem, the scattered Jewish people faced centuries of persecution across Europe and the Middle East.
Through 100 generations of exile, families ended every Passover meal with the same 4 words: "Next year in Jerusalem." In the late 1800s, a journalist named Theodor Herzl argued that the Jewish people should stop waiting and build a homeland of their own. He sparked a movement called Zionism, the push to create a modern Jewish state in the land the Romans kicked them out of centuries before. Waves of Jewish immigrants began arriving by boat. They bought up land, drained mosquito-filled swamps, and started farming ground that had been left alone for 2,000 years. The Jewish people were finally returning to their ancestral home. But the Arab population that had lived there for centuries watched the newcomers arrive with growing alarm, setting the stage for a collision that empires could no longer ignore. That collision was accelerated by Britain, which seized control of the region from the Ottoman Turks during World War I. For the first time in 400 years, the Holy Land had a new boss.
To win the war, Britain made contradictory promises to everyone. They promised Arab leaders an independent country in exchange for a rebellion against the Turks. Simultaneously, they issued the Balfour Declaration, a formal letter promising to support a national home for the Jewish people on that same land. By 1947, Britain was stuck in the middle of a violent rebellion and wanted out. They handed the problem to the United Nations, which proposed a plan to slice the land into 2 separate countries, side by side. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan as a path to a state of their own. The Arab leaders rejected it entirely, refusing to hand over land they had farmed for generations to newcomers who had only just arrived. The United Nations had drawn neat lines on a map, but the history of this land was far too jagged to be settled by a pen. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion announced the birth of the State of Israel. He hoped for the best, but he had to pray the country would survive the night. The next morning, 5 Arab armies invaded at once to crush the new nation. Israel was outnumbered on every border, yet it not only survived the invasion, but pushed the Arab armies back, expanding its territory well beyond the original United Nations lines. For the Jewish world, the miracle of their return was finally real. But there was a second, darker side to the war. 700,000 Palestinian Arabs lost their homes, fleeing violence or being forced out by Israeli troops. They call this the Nakba, the catastrophe. Many left with their keys in their pockets, expecting to return in weeks. They never did. In 1967, war broke out again, and Israel captured the old city of Jerusalem. After 1,900 years, the Jewish people held their holiest city once more. But in winning the war, Israel also became the ruler of millions of Palestinians who saw them as occupiers. History here isn't a single story. It is a series of layers. From Roman ruins to Crusader walls and modern skyscrapers, every inch of ground is overwritten by a different era and a different faith. Right now, the people living there are still waiting to see if those layers can ever be shared, or if they are destined to keep fighting over the same holy rock forever.